In the summer of 1974, Elvis Presley was at the height of his touring career. He was performing sold-out shows across the country, traveling by private jet and living a life that most people could only read about in magazines. But between the concerts and the travel, there were quiet moments, and it was in one of those moments that a simple request changed everything for one ordinary person. Elvis was in Memphis, staying at Graceland between tour dates. A young woman named Patricia Perry lived a few miles away. She was in her early 20s, working a regular job, and had been an Elvis fan since she was a child. She had grown up listening to his records, watched his movies on television, and followed his career the way millions of other fans did, from a distance, with no expectation of ever getting close. Patricia had a younger brother named Danny. He was 9 years old and had been diagnosed with a serious illness that kept him in and out of the hospital. Danny was also one of Elvis's biggest fans. He had a small collection of Elvis records that he kept by his bed, and he listened to them regularly. For Danny, Elvis was not just a singer. He was something that made a difficult situation a little more bearable. One afternoon, Patricia sat down and wrote a letter. She addressed it to Elvis Presley at Graceland. She did not ask for money, tickets, or autographs. She asked for one thing. She wanted to know if Elvis would be willing to record a short message on a cassette tape for her brother, something Danny could listen to from his hospital bed. That was the whole request, a recorded message, a few words from the man whose music had been with Danny through some of his hardest days. Patricia did not expect a response. She knew Elvis received thousands of letters every week. She knew there were people on staff whose entire job was to manage that correspondence. She assumed her letter would be read by someone in an office, filed away, and that would be the end of it. She sent it anyway, because she felt she had nothing to lose. What she did not know is that Elvis had a habit of going through his own mail. Not all of it, the volume made that impossible, but he would often sit with a selection of letters that had been flagged by staff. He liked knowing what people were writing to him about. His longtime friend and aide, Charlie Hodge, later recalled that Elvis took the mail seriously. He did not see it as a chore. He saw it as a connection to the people who had supported him throughout his career. Patricia's letter was pulled from the pile and brought to Elvis's attention. The people on his staff who handled correspondence remembered it specifically because of how straightforward it was. There was no dramatic story attached to it, no attempt to manipulate or exaggerate for effect. It was a sister asking for something small on behalf of her sick brother. It was written clearly and without any expectation that it would actually be read by Elvis himself. Elvis read the letter. According to people who were present at Graceland that day, he did not make a big announcement about it. He did not call a meeting or ask for help deciding what to do. He simply read it, set it down, and told the people around him that he wanted to do something for Danny. The request itself was modest by any measure. A cassette recording, a few words of encouragement from a famous person to a child who admired him. It would have taken 5 minutes to record and mail. Most people in Elvis's position, if they responded at all, would have done exactly that. A quick recording, a brief message, and back to the business of running a career. But Elvis did not treat the letter as something to check off a list. He treated it as something that actually mattered. What he decided to do instead of just recording a message was something that nobody in his circle anticipated. The people around him, his friends, his staff, the people who traveled with him and knew his routines, later said that even by Elvis's standards, what came next was not something they had seen before. It was not a publicity move, there were no cameras arranged, no press informed. It was simply Elvis deciding that a child who was going through something hard deserved more than a cassette tape. That decision, made quietly in a room at Graceland without any audience, is where this story really begins. After reading Patricia's letter, Elvis did not sit on the decision for long. People who were at Graceland that day recalled that he made up his mind fairly quickly. He was not someone who overthought these kinds of situations. When something struck him as the right thing to do, he moved on it. And this was one of those times. Elvis told Charlie Hodge, one of his closest friends and a constant presence at Graceland, that he wanted to find out more about Danny. He wanted to know which hospital the boy was staying in, what his condition was, and whether a visit was something that could actually happen. This was not a casual question. Elvis was asking his people to make real arrangements, and everyone around him understood the difference between Elvis expressing a passing thought and Elvis telling someone to get something done. Charlie made some calls. Patricia's contact information had been included in the letter, which made the process straightforward. Within a short time, someone from Elvis's circle reached out to Patricia directly. She later described the moment she received that call as something she was completely unprepared for. She had sent the letter weeks earlier and had moved on, assuming nothing would come of it. When someone called and told her that Elvis had read her letter and wanted to know more about Danny, her first reaction was disbelief. She thought it might be a prank. It was not. The person calling her was calm and straightforward about it. They explained that Elvis had seen the letter, that he understood the situation, and that he was looking into the possibility of doing something for Danny in person. Patricia confirmed the details: the name of the hospital, Danny's condition, the visiting hours, and restrictions that came with it. She answered every question and then waited, still not fully convinced that anything would actually come of it. Back at Graceland, Elvis was already thinking through what he wanted to do. A cassette recording was no longer part of the conversation. That idea had been set aside almost immediately. What Elvis was now considering was going to see Danny himself, not as a formal event, not as something organized for public attention, but as a private visit, just Elvis showing up at a hospital to spend time with a child who was a fan. The logistics of that kind of visit were not simple. Elvis could not walk into a public place without drawing a significant amount of attention. Even in 1974, when security arrangements were less elaborate than they would later become, an unannounced appearance by Elvis Presley in a hospital would create chaos quickly. His staff raised this point. They were not trying to talk him out of it. They were trying to figure out how to make it work without disrupting the hospital or the other patients. Elvis was patient about working through the details, but firm about the outcome he wanted. He was not looking for an event. He was not interested in having photographers present or making the visit into something that would end up in the newspapers. Several people who were with him that day said he was unusually clear about that. He wanted to see Danny. He wanted it to be calm, and he wanted the boy and his family to have the experience without it turning into something bigger than it needed to be. Arrangements were made with the hospital administration ahead of time. The visit was coordinated quietly. The staff at the hospital were informed, asked to keep the information contained, and given a time window. Elvis's team worked out an entry point that would minimize the number of people he would pass on the way in. It was organized carefully, but the goal throughout was to keep it as low-key as possible. Elvis did not bring a large group with him. He kept the number of people small, a couple of close friends, and the minimum security needed to manage the situation. He did not bring gifts that had been put together by a publicist or a team of assistants. What he brought was put together based on what he knew about Danny from Patricia's letter and the follow-up conversation his staff had with her. He knew what Danny liked. He paid attention to that. On the day of the visit, Elvis got ready without any particular ceremony. People at Graceland that morning said he was calm. There was no build-up, no discussion about what the visit would mean or how it would be received. He was simply going to see a child who had asked for nothing more than a recorded message, and he had decided that the child deserved something more than that. He left Graceland and headed to the hospital. Elvis arrived at the hospital in the mid-morning, when the hallways were quieter and the regular visitor had not yet picked up. The coordination that his team had done in advance made the entry smooth. A small group of hospital administrators met him at a side entrance, and from there he was taken directly toward Danny's ward without passing through the main lobby. The hospital staff who were informed about the visit had kept it contained. A few nurses on Danny's floor knew what was coming. Most of the other staff did not. The people who had been told were asked to carry on normally and not to make the arrival into a spectacle. By most accounts, they managed that well. The hallways in that section of the hospital stayed calm. Danny did not know Elvis was coming. Patricia had been told about the visit in advance, and she had made a deliberate choice not to tell her brother. She was not certain the visit would actually happen until it did, and she did not want to build up Danny's expectations and then have to explain why nothing came of it. So when Elvis walked through the door of Danny's hospital room, the boy had no warning. People who were present in that room described Danny's reaction as a moment of complete stillness. He was sitting up in his bed when the door opened. He looked at the person who walked in, and it took him a few seconds to process what he was seeing. He knew the face. He had seen it on record covers and in magazines and on television, but seeing it in person in his hospital room without any context that would have prepared him for it was something his mind had to catch up to. Elvis walked in without any introduction or announcement. He did not wait for Danny to fully register what was happening. He simply came in, pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and started talking to Danny the way you would talk to any child you were meeting for the first time. He asked Danny his name, even though he already knew it. He asked how he was feeling. He asked what he had been doing to pass the time in the hospital. Patricia was in the room and watched the entire exchange. She later talked about how quickly Danny came out of his initial shock. Within a few minutes, he was talking to Elvis without any of the hesitation or nervousness that most people would expect a 9-year-old to have in that situation. Elvis had a way of making the conversation feel ordinary. He was not performing. He was not giving Danny a version of himself that was calibrated for public consumption. He was simply sitting with a child and having a conversation. They talked about music. Danny told Elvis which songs he liked best, and Elvis listened and responded to each one specifically. He did not give generic answers. When Danny mentioned a particular song, Elvis talked about it, where he recorded it, what he remembered about it, small details that made the conversation feel personal rather than rehearsed. For a 9-year-old who had been listening to those records from a hospital bed, hearing the person who made them talk about them that way was something different from anything a cassette recording could have delivered. Elvis stayed longer than anyone had planned. The visit had been loosely scheduled with a time frame in mind, but Elvis did not watch the clock. The people who came with him waited outside the room and let the visit run at its own pace. Nobody came in to signal that it was time to wrap up. Elvis left when he felt the visit was complete, not when a schedule told him to. Before he got up to leave, Elvis gave Danny the items he had brought. They were specific to what he knew about the boy, not generic merchandise or signed photographs pulled from a stockpile. People who were there remembered that Danny reacted to each one individually, and that Elvis watched him open everything without rushing him. Patricia stood near the door through most of the visit. She had spent weeks assuming her letter had gone nowhere, and she was now watching the person she had written to sit in her brother's hospital room and give him an hour of his time. She did not say much during the visit itself. Afterwards, she described it as one of the few moments in her life where something turned out to be more than she had hoped for, rather than less. When Elvis left, he went back out the same way he came in. The hospital remained calm. There was no crowd waiting outside, no press, no photographs taken that day that ended up in circulation. The visit happened, and then it was over. In the days after Elvis left that hospital, the people who had been in the room did not rush to tell anyone about it. Patricia did not call a newspaper. The hospital staff who had been involved did not leak it to a local reporter. The visit stayed quiet for a while, which was exactly what Elvis had wanted. But over time, the story came out, not through a press release or a planned announcement, but through the natural way that significant personal experiences eventually get shared. Patricia talked about it first within her own family. She told the story to relatives at a gathering sometime after the visit, and the people who heard it passed it along to others. Danny, as he got older, talked about it himself. He described it the way people describe experiences that genuinely altered something in them, not with exaggeration, but with a kind of quiet certainty about what it had meant. He did not say Elvis saved his life, or that the visit changed the course of his illness. He said it made a hard period of time feel less isolating, and that the memory of it stayed with him in a way that very few things from that period did. What struck the people who heard the story was not the fact that Elvis had shown up. Famous people occasionally visit hospitals and make public appearances that are designed to generate goodwill. What struck them was the way he had done it. There was no record of it in the press from that time. No photographs surfaced of Elvis sitting beside Danny's bed. No one from Elvis's management team put out a statement about it. The visit existed only in the memories of the people who were there, and in the accounts they gave years later. Charlie Hodge, who was involved in arranging the visit and was present that day, spoke about it in interviews conducted after Elvis's death in 1977. He described it as representative of something he had seen many times over the years. Elvis responding to a personal situation, not because it served any purpose beyond the immediate one, but because he felt it was the right thing to do. Charlie was careful not to overstate it. He said Elvis was not a saint, and that anyone who knew him well understood he was a complicated person with his own difficulties. But on this particular kind of thing, responding to someone who needed something and had asked for it honestly, Elvis was consistent in a way that Charlie found genuinely notable. Others in Elvis's circle from that period made similar observations. The people who traveled with him, who worked at Graceland, who were part of his day-to-day life, frequently mentioned that the public version of Elvis and the private version were not as different as people sometimes assumed. The generosity that showed up in stories like Danny's was not a performance that Elvis switched on for effect. It was a pattern that ran through the way he handled these situations repeatedly across many years with many different people. For Danny, the visit became something he carried into adulthood. He recovered from his illness and grew up in Memphis. In interviews given decades later, he spoke about the visit with the same level of detail that people use when recounting experiences that made a permanent impression. He remembered the specific songs they talked about. He remembered where Elvis sat. He remembered the way Elvis looked at him when he was talking, directly, without distraction, as though the conversation was the only thing happening at that moment. That last detail came up more than once in accounts from people who had personal interactions with Elvis in private settings. The attentiveness, the fact that when Elvis was with you, he was actually with you. For a child in a hospital who was used to being the person that others felt sorry for, being treated as someone worth paying full attention to was its own kind of gift, separate from the visit itself. Patricia kept the letter she had written to Elvis. She also kept a short note that was sent to her from Graceland after the visit, a few lines acknowledging the experience and wishing Danny well. It was not written by Elvis himself, but it came from his household, and she treated it as part of the same story. Both items stayed with her for the rest of her life. The story of Danny and the letter and the visit that followed is not one of the famous Elvis stories. It was not documented by journalists at the time, and it does not appear in the major biographies as a central event. It's the kind of story that exists in the margins, told by the people it happened to, passed along through families, and eventually reaching a wider audience through the accumulated record of accounts that emerged after Elvis was gone. But that is also what makes it credible. Nobody had a reason to fabricate it. Nobody gained anything from telling it. It is simply what happened when a 9-year-old boy's sister wrote a letter, and the person she wrote it to decided to do more than what was asked.